down, will never come down. When the sun comes up, we'll be feeling how we do right now. My heart's on fire, coming down to the wire. While the world sleeps, we'll keep burning brighter and brighter.
Urian and I find the breeding side of dairy farming very tricky. There are many things we can try on our farm that give us quick feedback as to whether the change has worked. A good cow is one that makes it beyond 8 years, does it easily, performs well and has no problems. It will take us 9 years from this season's breeding decision before we know if we have generated an acceptable number of 8-year-old cows with our choices. If we miss the mark, it means something in our decision-making process is failing. We look very closely at our cows, very closely at the available bulls, and very closely at the quality of the mating. 9 years is a very long time in farming, and we cannot afford to repeat the same mistakes twice. If we go back 40 years, this herd originally was a New Zealand Friesian herd. In the early 90s, there was a little bit of Dutch Holstein blood introduced. This coincided with when my parents changed from 100% grass feeding to adding maize, attempting to feed the herd well and extend lactation length. The increase in production was very quick, but the cracks in the cows started to show immediately. The first thing that fell to pieces was the udders. It's very frustrating to feel like you're moving in the right direction with feeding, but at the same time are losing cows left, right and centre with udder breakdowns. It's a very costly exercise. American Holstein genetics were introduced into this herd back in the 90s. The American Holsteins of the time were doing a lot more production than New Zealand cows, and we thought that their advanced selection pressure for udder quality and udder attachment would be of great benefit to our herd. This logic worked wonders, and the first cross between New Zealand Friesians and US Holsteins was outstanding. The udder problems disappeared immediately, and the animals that resulted from the first cross were exceptional performers. At that point, it seemed like a no-brainer. American genetics were vastly superior and unequivocally the answer to our breeding problem at the time. We must have used American genetics for close to 15 years, I think, give or take, and it was almost exclusively. But we were never able to replicate the magic of that first cross. And the second cross, I think the udders were still improving, they were beautiful uddered cows, but the cracks were starting to show in the rest of the cow, and they were becoming a little bit less robust. And by the time we got to the third and fourth generation, they were a lot less robust. And so we'd gone from big, strong, capacious milking cows to tall, narrow animals. And the fertility had deteriorated, the temperament had deteriorated, they couldn't maintain their condition as well. You started to see the udders become actually too narrow, and so they're still technically good udders, but the teats were starting to cross over like that, and that's just really impractical milking at that point. And they were becoming a difficult animal to manage. It was just never ending in terms of what needed to be done to keep these cows functioning. And I'm very grateful that this all happened in the mid to late 2000s, because if we were breeding that kind of cow now, the changes that we'd have to make to our system to make her work would be so expensive. And I'm not even sure that it's a game that you can win.
It takes a lot of investment.
Yeah.
It
takes an awful lot of investment. I guess there's no limit to how much a kilo of milk solids can cost to produce.
Yeah, at some point you think we need a barn.
Yeah, I'm sure that.
But that's another million, and that million has to come back. Still got the good ones.
We've still got some good ones, but the percentage of bad ones was getting higher and higher. It takes the same amount of resources to raise a good animal as it does a bad one. And we are not a farm with unlimited resources. I sometimes wonder with breeding that it's actually less about the good ones that you create. It's more about how many bad ones are there. And so throughout that entire time period, the number of bad ones was just draining the system.
Young cows also produce less milk than older cows, so
that's true.
you can.
Funnily enough, when I first started working with Jersey cows, I wanted to try blending New Zealand Bull of the Day Jerseys with overseas Jersey genetics, and that worked brilliantly in the first cross. But in the second generation of overseas genetics, I began to see the same cracks appear. So the pattern was repeating itself all over again with Jerseys. In 2015, I was fortunate enough to go to the US, and I spent a couple of days in Wisconsin and Illinois, and I travelled with a man from Michigan who had been working in the dairy breeding industry for decades. He's very experienced. And he taught me the most valuable lesson I think I've ever learned when it comes to breeding. And funnily enough, it was all the things I'd already observed, but I wasn't able to articulate them. And he taught me that the key to any breeding strategy is whether or not it passes the 3-generation test. So in other words, if you've been using the same breeding strategy for 3 generations and the animals are still improving, then that's a pretty good strategy. But if you've used that strategy for 3 generations and they're starting to deteriorate, then there's a problem with the methodology. And
Quite logical.
it is quite logical, but it hit me like a ton of bricks because I'd observed that in Holsteins as a kid, I'd observed it in Jerseys as an adult, and I'd actually observed it in Brown Swiss because I used to have Brown Swiss as a kid. And so by the time I was 27 years old, I've learnt that it wouldn't matter how good of a cow I started off with, I could destroy her and her cow family in 3 generations.
Those brown Swisses, they were not impressive.
They were not impressive.
When I came here.
No, they were a failed experiment, and I destroyed them, baby. But it was a very valuable lesson.
Yeah.
And so, whatever we do in the future and whatever tinkering that we do to our breeding system, like that's always the anchor point is, does it pass the 3-generation test?
Yeah.
So if I look back with the benefit of hindsight, I actually think that the failing of the system that we were using previous was that we were actually putting a heap of attention on how we select our females. And we were putting a heap of attention on how we were selecting our bulls. But I think where we were failing was actually on the quality of the mating. So it's actually 10 years since we started using AAA.
Already?
Yeah, it's gone quite quickly. We look very closely at the AAA numbers of the bulls, and we're able to analyse our cows ourselves. So the AAA system actually forms the basis of the matings. Urian looks at bulls obsessively. Every single day of the year he is looking at bulls. Is that accurate?
No, bullshit.
I think you'll find it's accurate.
Every 2 weeks.
So
there are periods I never look at bulls. Sometimes time goes by that I just don't look into bulls at all.
I always say to Anthony, what is Pappy doing? And he'll say, he's looking at bulls, mummy.
It's complete bullshit.
Complete bullshit, okay. In case you think that I'm a female prone to exaggerating, a search history never lies. Here is Urian's search history for Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday. As you can see, it is bulls, bulls, bulls. This is an oversimplified explanation of our breeding strategy, but you'll get the gist, or you should get the gist. If you imagine a dial, okay, now on the left hand side of the dial you've got the New Zealand genetics, and they've got their positive features and their negative features. And then on the other end of the dial, on the right hand side of the dial, you've got the overseas genetics, and they've also got their positive features and their negative features that are very different to the New Zealand population. Now, we've come to the point as farmers that we think that the best that we can hope for is something that's bang smack in the middle, where you've got the best of both worlds, but you're trying to avoid the extremes of both sides. When it comes time to make a mating, we'll look at the cow in front of us and we'll say, okay, is she more to the New Zealand side of the dial? And if she's more to the New Zealand side of the dial, then we'll breed her with an overseas bull and hopefully bring her back to the middle. And vice versa. Cows that sit in the middle of the dial, they're quite tricky because whichever way you go, it's probably going to go a little bit too far. But we feel like we stay out of trouble because if we have a New Zealand cow, a cow that's smack in the middle, we think, okay, actually no, her components are not quite good enough, we're going to go to the New Zealand side. If she goes too extreme that way, we just bring her back to overseas genetics in the next generation. And so every generation, we're just weaving them back, kind of trying to stay middle of the road where you avoid the problems from going too far either side. You know, I think it's important to note that it is still possible to get good cows. People do it all the time, get good cows if they're just using New Zealand genetics, or they're just using overseas genetics. But every time that we've done that, we've just had a few too many bad ones, where we think, actually, there's just a bit too much wastage for us there.
Those New Zealand cows, they have also a lot of qualities.
They do.
And
It'd be really foolish to think
Yeah.
that one was better than the other. They've both got good points. They've both got things that you have to protect for.
yeah,
And-
so we at some point we thought, why would we use an overseas bull for the 516 category, for example?
Yeah.
It's not needed.
It's
because
not needed.
But based on what we get, we might, in 6 years' time, we might have a different opinion about it.
Yeah.
So but at this point, we think this is for us now the best the way to go.
Yeah. Over the years, we have had to narrow down our parameters when selecting bulls. That has been driven by observations of what happens when we do not have limits in place. We want overseas bulls that lift udders, improve udder texture, open up the pelvic area, increase components and strength without making them narrow, infertile and difficult to maintain condition. We used a bull called Newhouse Jordan. He added all of these good things when used on wide-chested dairy cows with sprung ribs and good volumes of milk. They are beautiful cows, but my God, did the temperament degenerate. We cannot breed from these cows because the milking temperament is so bad. We started with 5 and now have 2, and the removals have all been temperament related. He was a lower than average temperament bull, maybe 97 when we first used him. Now he is 94, which is well below average. It's choices like these that have cost us dearly and in this case led to a high failure rate. That is why 100 is the absolute lowest we would accept on our key selection traits when looking at potential bulls. One of the really interesting developments in the last couple of years is that finally there's some overseas bulls that are getting very, very high BWs on the New Zealand system. And that hasn't happened for such a long time. And so we decided to have a very close look at these overseas bulls to see if we could find a place for them. And we like to run the figures through the Dutch, would you call it a database or the Dutch indexing system? That's
Dutch indexing system.
Yeah, and so these American bulls, the American bulls seem to be getting much higher BWs than the Dutch bulls were. And so we ran it through the Dutch system, the Dutch index, see what was coming up and if they could work for us. And there was a real pattern with what was happening. And so those bulls had very, very high volumes.
With high fat?
Really high fat. And they're very low live weight for an overseas bull. So they weren't getting the live weight deductions that I think overseas bulls have historically gotten. But when we ran those bulls through the Dutch indexing system, they came up as being very negative for chest width and very negative for condition score. We want cows that are wide and powerful in the front that can carry a little bit of condition, but they're going to get penalised with their live weight BVs. And we've had it in the past where we've used a bull that met all of our other criteria, but he was negative for chest width and he was negative for condition score. And you really see it in his daughters. Even though we used him on wide cows, he's moved the dial too far. And we don't like that kind of animal.
We were actually just trying to use him on our roundest cows, the widest cows, and he just moved the dial too far. So we know now when we're choosing an overseas bull that we actually have to protect for those things. Yeah, we have to put a limit in.
We have to put a limit in, yeah.
Yeah, so they have to be positive.
But these bulls that are getting high BWs are below the limit of those criteria for us, so we have to throw them out. And I guess this, it's a bit of a contradiction because I've been trying to think if I've ever come across a farmer that wants narrow, thin cows.
I don't want to milk skinny cows.
No, it goes against your better instinct as a farmer.
When picking out overseas Holsteins, the first thing we look at is components. They need to be very positive for fat and protein percentages. We prefer lower milk volume bulls because they tend to be slower maturing animals. They need to be positive for longevity, udder health, fertility, and hoof health. We also like them to be positive for reproductive disorders and resilience, which measures how susceptible they are to health problems and how quickly they recover. Being good for somatic cell count and positive for temperament are absolute non-negotiables. They need to be low stature because we don't want them too tall, and positive for chest width and condition score. Our main overseas Holstein bull for this breeding season is a Dutch red Holstein called Launch PP. He is a daughter-proven bull with a AAA code of 345. We plan to use him on our crossbred cows that tend more to the New Zealand side of the dial.
It's an overly reductionist argument to compare kilos of milk solids to kilos of live weight because the interactions between a cow and her environment are so complex that to narrow it down to just comparing those two things doesn't paint the full picture. And then you get a situation with indexing where you're biasing the efficiency side of the equation, which, don't get me wrong, I think it's an important part of the equation. But if it's coming at the expense of the robustness of the animal, at some point you're going to run out of gas. Now, maybe we're the only people in the world that have experienced it this way, but when we've gone too far with selecting bulls that are negative for chest width and negative for condition score, the animals that we're working with just don't work as well as we need them to.
I want to add something different. So in the Netherlands, there are some farms that measure the feed efficiency. So they need the feed. They measure what goes in and what comes out. Yeah. They start and they say, those farmers have no idea what kind of cow it actually is. They after 150 days they put those cows on those boxes. It can be a fat cow, it can be a skinny cow. They have actually no idea. It's not that they are the smallest cows that are the best ones.
Yeah.
They have actually no idea. They just put cows on, and they have just no idea which ones are the best ones. So that actually says that those correlations that they come up with, they are
at best they're questionable.
Yeah.
At worst, it's something else.
Yeah.
And then at a certain point, you're not comparing cows, you're comparing feed. Because if you put 20 kilos of grass in, that's very different than putting 10 kilos of grass and 10 kilos of concentrates in. So how it's been reduced to this general consensus is a little bit, I can't quite get my head around. But it is the conventionally accepted wisdom when it comes to efficiency. And that's the number that you hear. So
you always have to correct for your own observation. So you can start with an idea, but your observations have to correct that. You have to. You have to. You don't have to, but you can correct for it. We try to correct for it for what we see. So those jitterbugs, for example, they're too light. Too narrow. They don't have enough conditions, so we stay away from that.
Yeah.